and systemic racism that has plagued our nation for far, far too long. I said that over the course of the past year that the blinders have been taken off the nation, the American people. What many Americans didn't see or had simply refused to see couldn't be ignored any longer. Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that took George Floyd's life opened the eyes of millions of Americans and millions of people around all over the world. It was the knee on the neck of justice, and it wouldn't be forgotten. It stirred the conscience and of tens of millions of Americans, and in my view, it marked a turning point in this country's attitude toward racial justice. When the six-year-old daughter, Gianna, who I met with when I met with the family, I leaned down to say hi to her, and she said, looked at me, and she said, "Daddy changed the world." That's what Gianna said, his daughter. Daddy changed the world. And I believe she was right. Not because this kind of injustice stopped, it clearly hasn't, but because the ground has shifted, because it's changed minds and mindsets, because it laid the groundwork for progress. COVID-19 has further ripped a path of destruction through every community in America, but no one has been spared. But the devastation in communities of color has been nothing short of stunning. Just look at the numbers. 40% of frontline workers, nurses, first responders, grocery store workers, are Americans of color, and many are still living on the edge. 1 in 10 Black Americans is out of work today. 1 in 11 Latino Americans is out of work today. 1 in 7 households in America, about 1 in 4 Black, 1 in 5 Latino households in America, report that they don't have enough food to eat in the United States of America. Black and Latino Americans are dying of COVID-19 at rates nearly 3 times that of white Americans. And it's not white Americans' fault, but just a fact. And the Americans now know it, especially younger Americans. One of the reasons I'm so optimistic about this nation is that today's generation of young Americans is the most progressive, thoughtful, inclusive generation that America has ever seen. And they are pulling us toward justice in so many ways, forcing us to confront the huge gap in economic inequity between those at the top and everyone else, forcing us to confront the existential crisis of climate, and yes, forcing us to confront systemic racism and white supremacy. It's just been weeks since all of America witnessed a group of thugs, insurrectionists, a political extremist, and white supremacists violently attack the capital of our democracy. And so now's the time to act. It's time to act because that's what the faith and morality call us to do. Across nearly every faith, the same principles hold. We're all God's children. We should treat each other as we would like to be treated ourselves. And this is time to act, and this time to act is because it's what the core values of this nation call us to do. And I believe the vast majority of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, share these values and want us to act as well. We have never fully lived up to the founding principles of this nation, to state the obvious, that all people are created equal and have a right to be treated equally throughout their lives. And it's time to act now, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we do, we'll all be better off for it. For too long, we've allowed a narrow, cramped view of the promise of this nation to fester. You know, we've bought the view that America is a zero-sum game in many cases. If you succeed, I fail. If you get ahead, I fall behind. If you get the job, I lose mine. Maybe worst of all, if I hold you down, I lift myself up. We've lost sight of what President Kennedy told us when he said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." And when we lift each other up, we're all lifted up. You know, and the corollary is true as well. When any one of us is held down, we're all held back. More and more economic studies in recent years have proven this. But I don't think you need economic studies to see the truth. Just imagine if instead of consigning millions of American children to under-resourced schools, We gave each and every 3-4-year-old child a chance to learn, to go to school, not daycare, school, and grow, and thrive in school and throughout. When they've done that, the places have been done, it shows they have an exponentially greater chance of going all the way through 12 years of school and doing it well. But you know, does anyone in this whole nation think we're not all better off if that were to happen? Just imagine if instead of denying millions of Americans the ability to own a home and build generational wealth, we made it possible for them to buy a home, their first home, and begin to build equity to provide for their families and send their children off to school. Does anyone doubt that the whole nation would be better off? Just imagine, instead of denying millions of young entrepreneurs the ability to access capital, we made it possible to take their dream to market, create jobs, reinvest in their own communities. Does anyone doubt this whole nation wouldn't be better off? Just imagine if more incredibly creative and innovative, how much more creative and innovative we'd be if this nation held the historic black colleges and universities to the same opportunities and minority-serving institutions that had the same funding and resources of public universities to compete for jobs in industries of the future. You know, just ask the first HBCU graduate elected as vice president if that's not true. But to do this, I believe this nation and this government need to change their whole approach to the issue of racial equity. Yes, we need criminal justice reform, but that isn't nearly enough. We need to open the promise of America to every American, and that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government. That's why I issued, on one of the first days, my whole of government executive order that will, for the first time, advance equity for all throughout our federal policies and institutions. It focuses on the full range of communities who have been long underserved and overlooked. People of color, Americans with disabilities, LGBTQ Americans, religious minorities, rural, urban, suburban communities facing persistent poverty. And I've asked Ambassador Susan Rice to lead the administration's charge through the White House and Domestic Policy Council, because I know she'll see it through. Every White House component and every agency will be involved in this work because advancing equity has to be everyone's job. Today, I'll be shortly signing an additional package of executive actions to continue this vital work. Housing, for example. Housing is a right in America, and home ownership is an essential tool to wealth creation and to be passed down to generations. Today, I'm directing the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs and Urban Development to redress the historical racism in federal housing policies. Today, I'm directing the federal agency to reinvigorate the consultation process with Indian tribes. Respect for tribal sovereignty will be a cornerstone of our engaging with Native American communities. This builds on the work we did last week to expand tribes' access to the Strategic National Stockpile for the first time, to ensure they receive help from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to fight this pandemic. Today, I'm directing federal agencies to combat resurgence of xenophobia, particularly against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that we've seen skyrocket during this pandemic. This is unacceptable, and it's un-American. I've asked the Department of Justice to strengthen its partnership with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to prevent those hate crimes. Health and Human Services to put out best practices for combating xenophobia in our national response to COVID. Look, in the weeks ahead, I'll be reaffirming the federal government's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, building on the work we started in the Obama-Biden administration. That's why I'm rescinding the previous administration's harmful ban on diversity and sensitivity training and abolish the offensive counterfactual 1776 Commission. Unity and healing must begin with understanding and truth, not ignorance and lies. Today, I'm also issuing an executive order that will ultimately end the Justice Department's use of private prisons, an industry that houses pretrial detainees and federal prisoners. The executive order directs the Attorney General to decline to renew contracts with privately operated criminal facilities, a step we started to take at the end of the Obama administration and was reversed under the previous administration. This is the first step to stop corporations from profiting off of incarceration that is less humane and less safe, as the studies show. And it is just the beginning of my administration's plan to address systemic problems in our criminal justice system. Here's another thing we need to do. We need to restore and expand the Voting Rights Act, named after our dear friend John Lewis, and continue to fight back against laws that many states are engaged in to suppress the right to vote while expanding access to the ballot box for all eligible voters. Because here's the deal, and I'll close with this. I ran for president because I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. And the simple truth is, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to persist. We can't eliminate it. It's not going to be overnight. We can't eliminate everything, but it's corrosive, it's destructive, and it's costly. It cost every American, not just who felt the sting of racial injustice. We are not just a nation morally deprived because of systemic racism. We're also less prosperous. We're less successful. We're less secure. So we must change, and I know it's going to take time, but I know we can do it. And I firmly believe the nation is ready to change. But government has to change as well. We need to make equity and justice part of what we do every day. Today, tomorrow, and every day. And I'm going to sign these executive actions to continue the work to make real the promise of America for every American. Again, I'm not promising we can end it tomorrow, but I promise you we're going to continue to make progress to eliminate systemic racism, and every branch of the White House and the federal government is going to be part of that effort. Thank you. Excuse me. My pen over here.
What do you mean?
This first executive order is a memorandum for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to redress our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. Next executive order is reforming the incarceration system by eliminating the use of privately operated criminal detention facilities. Third executive order is a memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agencies. Tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships. And the last executive order is condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders of the United States. I think the country's ready, and I know this administration is ready. Thank you.
Mr. President, what you talking about now?
You.
It's President Joe Biden there signing some executive actions on racial equality. He's been outlined a plan for racial equality, and he said that he ran for president because he felt the soul of the nation was at stake. And he said the American soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism was allowed to continue. Well, let's cross live now to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, talk us through some of those executive actions that the president is going to undertake.
Yeah, well, with the signature, what we see is a stark contrast to the previous administration in terms of priorities. That this is a conscious shift, in some cases, even undoing policies of the previous administration that Joe Biden felt were counter to his ultimate goal, and that is achieving racial equity and justice. He said, and referenced the death of George Floyd, that those 8 minutes and so many seconds that there was the police officer's knee on his neck as the world was captivated by that death. And it was the beginning of this tipping point in terms of change. And so he's acknowledging his part in bringing about that change as president of the United States. So there are a number of different actions here, 4 to be precise, and they address a number of areas that historically in the United States we've seen gross racial inequality, particularly this first one pertaining to the issue of home ownership. And just very briefly, for decades in the United States, mortgage companies have been allowed to have predatory mortgages and loans to communities of color at higher interest rates, essentially cutting them out of the market, keeping them away from this generational wealth that we heard Biden referencing there in order to pass this on. So, in other words, contributing to generational poverty in many cases. So now the Department of Housing and Urban Development will not only be seeking to turn these policies around, but will be mandated to do so. Another important part where we see disproportionate numbers of black, brown people being treated unfairly is when it comes to incarceration. That's a really big piece of it. And criminal justice reform is something that was taken up by the Trump administration, but not to the extent that there has been significant change. So what we're seeing now is this commitment, the end of the use of private prisons. This is a big deal because for so long in this country, people have been allowed to make profit out of other people's misfortune in many cases. So this is something that is not going to be allowed, at least at the federal level. The state level is a completely different story. Also, what we've seen here is an executive action to reaffirm the sovereignty of tribal nations. In other words, First Nations people. You heard the president there referencing the nation-to-nation relationship, giving an equal platform with the federal government. This is a big shift, a huge shift, and something that has been long sought after by so many in the First Nations communities here in the United States. And finally, something that we've seen reversing a trend that had previously been in the right direction, going in the wrong direction with COVID-19, has been the targeting of Asian Americans. Many pointing the finger, somewhat ignorantly blaming Asian Americans who are often born here in the United States for the fact that COVID-19 has decimated the economy, has killed so many hundreds of thousands of Americans. Now there will be efforts at the federal level to combat xenophobia. So these are some of the actions that this president has taken, but you heard from his comments there, by no means will they be the last. This is something that the president campaigned on. He's promised, given the fact that he sees hope and he sees a generational shift in the United States, to bring in more policies to encourage the United States to move in the right direction when it comes towards equity and racial justice.
He's obviously shown that it was a priority, and as you say, something that he campaigned on and presumably a lot of people voted him in for, but he himself doesn't shy away from the fact that it is going to be difficult for the U.S. to shed some of its past ways.
Yeah, and one of the big problems in all of this is, and where we see a big sort of fraction in the United States, is the fact that inequality isn't just racial in the United States, it's also economic. And that encompasses a large number of white communities as well, particularly when you're talking about rural areas. And this is where we saw Donald Trump gain so much traction. And that is going to be the challenge, is that in trying to achieve this racial equality, how to also make those communities feel included. And you actually heard Joe Biden referencing those communities when he spoke just a few moments ago. That wasn't an accident. He's trying to say that he's a president for all Americans, even those that did not vote for him. You've acknowledged, and the big problem in trying to achieve that unity, though, is going to be bringing on board those people that feel Joe Biden doesn't speak for them, even as a white American himself. So this is the challenge he's going to have to undertake, and it's going to be a difficult one because the American history precedes, the last 20 years of tensions. It goes back centuries, and it's going to take a while to repair.
Ernie is back at it again.